Okay, so today we're going to be giving the Growing Threat Precon a complete That wasn't even on purpose. A complete overhaul. That's hilarious. Okay, I'm getting over a sickness. Forgive me. Anyway. Okay, that was funny. So the idea here is that because the Precon is lackluster and requires more cards to improve the deck beyond a normal budget upgrade, we're instead going to rebuild the Precon from scratch, improving the functionality of the deck while sticking to the normal budget of buying a Precon and upgrading it. If you want a review of the original Precon, I'll link that below and throw the card thing up at the top of the video. The price limit for this deck is going to be the price of the Precon in a store, which is about $50 after taxes or after shipping, plus an upgrade budget of about $20 to compensate for the desirable reprints in a Precon that increase its value beyond the price of a Precon. Think Vanquisher's banner in the original Precon, which is about $15 and absolutely not a budget card. The price, as with all of my other deck techs, do not include the mana base and is based on prices at the time I built the deck. Like the Precon, Brimaz will be our face commander. It's a 3/4 legendary Phyrexian cat for 2 white/black that says whenever you cast a Phyrexian creature or artifact creature spell, incubate X, where X is that spell's mana value. Incubate says create an incubator token with X 1/1 counters on it and pay 2 to transform it into a 0/0 Phyrexian artifact creature, and then that has the counters on it, so it's however big. Then, at the beginning of each end step, if a Phyrexian died under your control this turn, proliferate. In order to stay on flavor by sticking with Phyrexian creatures, we're going to make them bigger through Brimaz's proliferate ability and popping out our incubator tokens whenever an opponent or we decide to wipe the board. So, starting with the junk Phyrexians, we have Phyrexian Rager, which will draw us a card and lose a life when it ETBs, Crawling Chorus, which will leave behind another Phyrexian Might when it dies, replacing itself to be able to trigger Brimaz twice in a turn, or once again in another turn. Mursire will do the same thing, but it'll give you a Phyrexian Mur instead. Annex Sentry will exile an artifact or creature an opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield, giving it some removal ability. Bloodline Pretender will get 1/1 counters as Phyrexian's ETB. Icarats has Infect and will give everyone a poison counter when it dies. If this happens, you can proliferate your opponent's poison counters, leading them to a potentially quick death. Infested Fleshcutter is an equipment that creates Phyrexian Mights when the equipped creature attacks. Shrine of Loyal Legions gets charge counters at your upkeep or when you cast a white spell. Then you can pay 3 and tap and sacrifice it to create 1/1 Phyrexian Mur tokens for each charge counter on it. You can also proliferate those charge counters with Brimaz to make that number bigger over time. Nested Ghoul says when a source deals damage to it, put a 2/2 Phyrexian zombie on the field. It says Phyrexian zombie, the text has been eroded if you have an old version of this card. If you can give this thing a counter and make it bigger, its survival rate will go up and allow you to make more and more Phyrexian zombies. Our better Phyrexians are Necrosquito, a flying 0/0 that ETBs with 2 oil counters on it and gets +1/+1 for each oil counter on it. Then it gets another oil counter whenever an artifact or creature you control goes into the graveyard from the battlefield. And again, you can proliferate those oil counters too. Ellis Ilkor will give you a bit of life gain when creatures ETB on your field and make your opponents lose life when your creatures die. It can also be a nice deterrent since it has Death Touch. Norn's Inquisitor fits our incubate theme nicely. It says when it ETBs, incubate 2. Then, whenever a permanent you control transforms into a Phyrexian, put a 1/1 counter on it. So this just makes our incubate tokens a little bit bigger. Icarshade is a 2/3 that says at the beginning of your end step, if an artifact or creature was put into a graveyard from the battlefield this turn, put a 1/1 counter on it. This should happen pretty often, and then Brimaz will proliferate that counter, giving it 2 counters in total. Grafted Butcher is a 2/2 that gives your Phyrexians menace until the end of turn. It says other Phyrexians you control gets +1/+1, and then you can pay 3 and a black, sacrifice an artifact or creature to return it to the battlefield from your graveyard as a sorcery. Getting Grafted Butcher back onto the battlefield this way won't give you another incubate token, but sacrificing something else to trigger the ability will give you a Brimaz proliferate trigger. Filigree Vector says when it ETBs, put a 1/1 counter on each of any number of target creatures and a charge counter on each of any number of target artifacts. Then you can pay 1 and tap and sacrifice another artifact to proliferate. Vulpine Harvester says whenever one or more Phyrexians you control attack, return target artifact card from your graveyard to the battlefield if its mana value is less or equal to their total power. We have 3 artifacts and 7 artifact creatures that we can recur with this card, which isn't ideal, but it might be better to sacrifice a mana rock or a weak artifact creature rather than an incubator token with 4 counters on it. Bloated Processor says sacrifice another Phyrexian, put a 1/1 counter on Bloated Processor. Then, when it dies, incubate X where X is its power. This is board wipe protection. Sack everything and let the board wipe happen to kill the processor and get a very big incubator token in return. Phyrexian Censor says each player can't cast more than 1 non-Phyrexian spell each turn, and non-Phyrexian creatures enter the battlefield tapped. Progenitor Exarch is very good here. It costs 2x and a white and says when it ETBs, incubate 3 X times. Then you can tap it to transform target incubator token you control. This saves you 2 mana, which can be a pretty big deal if you're light on mana, which you probably would be in white. Essence of Orthodoxy is a flying 3/3 that says whenever it or another Phyrexian ETBs under your control, incubate 2. This basically doubles your incubate triggers from Brimaz, which can be a big deal if the board gets wiped. Terror of Tawashi is a 4/3 with Death Touch that says when it attacks, you can pay 3 and a black. When you do, return target creature from your graveyard to the battlefield. It's a Phyrexian in addition to its other types. And this becomes more useful if you dump more mana-hungry creatures into the graveyard, and getting back one of your better creatures onto the field for a low price isn't really a bad thing. Massacre Worm is just a big Phyrexian that will clear the board of small chump blockers and drain opponents when their creatures die. Then we have Kirik, Son of Yawgmoth, a 2/2 with lifelink that turns all of your black pips into Phyrexian black mana, so you can pay 2 life instead of black mana to cast those spells. Then when you cast a black spell, it gets a 1/1 counter. When this gets bigger, and if it gets a chance to attack, you'll gain back much of the life you might have spent to cast spells. Then Brimaz will proliferate those counters as well. Since our creatures aren't really mana hungry, we'll be dumping our hands pretty quickly, so next is our card draw package. But before we move on, if you like what you've seen so far, why don't you hit that like button and sub to the channel so you don't miss more videos like this in the future. It'll help the channel grow and tell YouTube to share the video with more people who might be interested in it also. Thanks. Costly Plunder, Village Rites, Deadly Dispute, and Plumb the Forbidden are instant spells that will let us sacrifice creatures or artifacts to draw cards. Deadly Dispute will get us a treasure when we do also, and Plumb the Forbidden will let us capitalize on an opponent's board wipe to refill our hand in response. Norin's Wellspring will let us scry 1 and put an oil counter on it when a creature we control dies. Then we can pay 1, tap it, and remove 2 oil counters to draw a card. Again, Brimaz's Proliferate will let this happen more often, maybe being able to activate it every turn. Folk Hero says, commander creatures you own have, whenever you cast a spell that shares a creature type with this creature, draw a card. This only happens once each turn, so since this is Phyrexian Tribal, it's an easy include. Idol of Oblivion will tap and let us draw a card the same turn we create a token, and that shouldn't be too hard to pull off. You can also pay 8, tap and sack it to create a 10/10 Eldrazi if you really want to, but if you have giant incubator tokens, 2 mana might be a better investment. Morbid Opportunist is a creature that says whenever 1 or more other creatures die, draw a card. This only happens once each turn, but if you block an attack and a creature dies, you'll draw a card from this and Brimaz will proliferate too. Norn's Decree is fun. It says whenever 1 or more creatures an opponent controls deals combat damage to you, that opponent gets a poison counter. And whenever a player attacks, if 1 or more players being attacked are poisoned, the attacking player draws a card. This only gets you 1 card per attack, but if your opponents let themselves get poisoned, Proliferate is going to make them regret it. Then we have Skullclamp. Since we want our creatures to die, and even if they don't die when being equipped, you can put it on a token that you'll be blocking with anyway and get the cards when it dies. And finally, Pact of the Serpent, a sorcery that says choose a creature type. Target player draws X cards and loses X life, where X is the number of creatures they control of the chosen type. Ideally, you'll choose Phyrexian and draw a bunch of cards, but if an opponent is going crazy with tokens, this could take them out if their life is low enough. With card draw out of the way, let's build on our primary strategy for the deck, 1/1 counters. Aaron, Benalia's Ruin is a 3/3 Phyrexian creature with Menace, and you can pay a white and a black, tap it, and sack a creature to put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control. With Brimaz on the field, this turns into 2 counters in total by the end of the turn. Feign the Broker is a 3/3 legendary creature that has 3 tap abilities. Tap and sack a creature to put 2 1/1 counters on a target creature. Tap and remove a counter from a creature you control to create a treasure token. Tap and sack an artifact to create a 2/1 Inkling with flying. Then you can pay 3 into black to untap Feign the Broker. The fact that none of the precons included any battles is a big misstep, so we fixed that with Invasion of New Capenna. It has a defensive 4, and when it ETBs, you may sack an artifact or a creature. When you do, exile a target artifact or creature an opponent controls. If you defeat it, you can cast its backside Holy Frazzle Cannon, an equipment with an equip cost of 1 that says whenever equipped creature attacks, put a 1/1 counter on that creature and each other creature you control that shares a creature type with it. I love this card so much. Then Ajani, Adversary of Tyrants, a planeswalker for 2 and 2 white that has 4 loyalty. His +1 says put a 1/1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. -2 says return target creature card with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. -7 says you get an emblem with. At the beginning of your end step, create 3 1/1 white cat tokens with lifelink. Next, we'll add some additional proliferate cards. Blightbelly Rat will proliferate when it dies and give an opponent a poison counter if they don't block it. Grateful Apparition is a 1/1 with flying that will let you proliferate when it deals damage to a player or planeswalker. If this happens to get a counter on it, it can become a pretty big flying threat also. Throne of Geth will let us sacrifice an artifact to proliferate. You may immediately think to sack your incubate tokens, which is fine if there are, few counters on it, like 1 or 2. But if you have the Vulpine Harvester on the field, you can sack a Mana Rock or artifact creature with proliferate to the throne, attack with some Phyrexians, and get the sacked card back onto the battlefield afterwards. Then of course there's Karn's Bastion, a land that lets you pay 4 and tap to proliferate. Atrax's Skitterfang is an artifact Phyrexian that ETBs with 3 oil counters on it. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you can remove an oil counter from it to give a target creature flying, vigilance, death touch, or lifelink until end of turn. This will help your giant creatures get through for damage because they don't have any keywords, or gain you life in an emergency. Arcbound Crusher is an artifact creature with trample and modular 1. It ETBs with a 1/1 counter on it, and when it's put into a graveyard, you may put its 1/1 counters on a target artifact creature. Whenever another artifact enters the battlefield, put a 1/1 counter on it. This includes your opponent's artifacts, so it can get pretty big thanks to treasure tokens. And then we have Replicating Ring, an artifact for 3 that taps for mana of any color. Then it says at the beginning of your upkeep, put a night counter on it. Then if it has 8 or more night counters on it, remove all of them and create 8 copies of Replicating Ring with tap to add mana of any color. Proliferate will let this happen quicker. To get some of our better creatures back onto the field when they die, we added a bit of recursion. Phyrexian Missionary is a 2/3 with lifelink for 1 and a white and a kicker of 1 and a black. When it ETBs, if it was kicked, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Victimize is a sorcery that says choose 2 target creature cards in your graveyard, sacrifice a creature. If you do, return the chosen cards to the battlefield tapped. Our single target removal consists of Despark, Rite of Oblivion, Generous Gift, Swords to Plowshares, and Path to Exile. Our board wipes are Sunfall and White Sun's Twilight. Our ramp package is basically the same as the Precon with Mind Stone, Orzhov Signet, Talisman of Hierarchy, Arcane Signet, and Soul Ring. And finally, our miscellaneous pieces. Completed Huntmaster is a creature that lets us pay 1, tap, and sack another creature or artifact to incubate 3. This will be handy to make any incubate tokens with 1 or 2 counters on it bigger, or let us sack a Phyrexian to trigger Brimaz. Phyrexian Awakening is an enchantment with incubate 4 and says Phyrexians you control have vigilance. Might Overseer is a 4/2 with first strike that says as long as it's your turn, creature tokens you control get +1/+0 and have first strike. And this will buff our transformed incubate tokens. Hagra Constrictor enters with 2 1/1 counters on it and says each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it has menace. And Mare Ek Nightblade is a 2/3 with Outlast that says each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it has death touch. Then you add 35 lands of your choice and you're done. With this rebuild, we managed to give the deck some more focus with counters and proliferate, added some much needed evasion for our more generic creatures, added plenty of card draw to make up for our low mana curve, and managed to keep it mostly Phyrexian flavored. According to the Moxfield total, this deck comes to about $60, giving us $10 worth of improvement if we want to be nitpicky about the price rules, but who knows what the prices of some of these cards will be in a few weeks anyway. There are plenty of high budget improvements that can be made if we want to make them. My 3 picks for this are Pitiless Plunderer to get treasures when our creatures die to help pay the transformation tax, Vanquisher's Banner because it was in another Precon and would be great in this deck, and then Cathar's Crusade because you probably suck at counting and will want to practice every time you play a Phyrexian or created a creature token. Lord help your opponents if you cast White Sun's Twilight with this on the field. I'm actually pretty happy with how this looks, but why don't you let me know what you think in the comments below? Maybe share what you'd change or what direction you might take the deck if you built it from scratch. And that's about it. So like the video if you liked the video, dislike it if you disliked it, and until next time, I'm Space Coconut, and you're welcome.